company-driven censorship or content moderation practices on the internet, we eluded ourselves for a long time by saying that this was just the actions of private companies deciding what they did and didn't want to see on their own platforms, which sounds reasonable enough. One of the things we've learned over the last couple of years is that actually these aren't the actions of private companies. They're the actions of government actors coordinating with private companies to decide what does and does not show up on the internet. It is state action in disguise. In the US, we're now seeing that actually, speaking of Twitter, before Elon Musk took over Twitter, there's now evidence that actually came out that Alex Berenson, who was a critic of the US government in the US, was specifically the target of White House officials who met with Twitter officials to pressure them and ask them why they hadn't taken down his account, which eventually those Twitter officials went on to do. And so I think one of the things that's coming out with the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter is that it's not only that it's no longer a public company, it's no longer a company that appears to be taking the same kind of direction from the US government. And I think that what he said more recently is that he's been going to put a spotlight on some of the censorship decisions that Twitter did make. What was the rationale and what was the communications behind them? I think that's going to expose a lot, suggesting that Twitter, even on its own as a company, wasn't even making these censorship decisions. It was actually doing it as the censorship arm of the US government and possibly other governments around the world too. I think a lot of this dates back to the 2008 financial crisis, actually, and I write about this in Woke Inc., where what happened in 2008 was that capitalists went from being viewed as the good guys, the heroes in the pre-2008 era, to being viewed as the bad guys by the old left afterwards, especially on the back of receiving the government bailouts. And what happened was that what they said was, you know what, instead of the old left coming after us and doing the things that Occupy Wall Street wanted us to do, we'll make a bargain. We'll use our corporate power to advance the objectives of a new left that had slightly different concerns than the old left. The old left was all about economic redistribution, take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and give it to poor people to help poor people. This new sort of, we'll call it the woke left that emerged right around the same time, around the time of Barack Obama's election as president of the United States, what they said was actually the theory of the case is slightly different. We care more about systemic racism and misogyny and bigotry and climate change and the racially disparate impact of climate change and so on. And so what they said was, look, if you advance our objectives, we'll look the other way to leave your power structure intact. And so that happened on Wall Street, where the Occupy Wall Street left wanted to occupy Wall Street, this new woke left that said that, okay, push that Occupy Wall Street left to one side, we'll do a deal with you guys. And that was great for major financial institutions where, effectively a bunch of big banks got in bed with a bunch of woke millennials. Together they birthed woke capitalism. They used that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. And then Silicon Valley realized that they could then play the same game. Because Silicon Valley realized that in the pre-2008, 2010 era, the biggest threat to their monopoly power used to come from the old left, right? Break up big tech was a left-wing slogan long before it was a right-wing slogan in the United States. But what they recognized was that, you know what? We can use our monopoly power in service of the objectives that the new left cares about, to censor or take down hate speech or misinformation, as that new progressive movement defines it. But just like the Wall Street guys, we won't do it for free. We effectively expect that new left to look the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact. And so I think it was actually this sort of arranged marriage between two bedfellows who didn't particularly love one another, right? This is not an arranged marriage of love I'm talking about. It is more like a form of mutual prostitution that worked for as long as each side got something out of the trade. And I think that became the bargain for both sides, is to say that Silicon Valley gets to grow unchecked with respect to its corporate power, its network effects, in ways that defanged the concerns of the left, so long as they actually substantively use that power to advance certain of the substantive political ends of that same left that once wanted to go after them. That's what's going on. Google ceremoniously, to satisfy some of those very activists in the US, said they were leaving China. Don't be evil was the policy. They won't carry out the bidding of the CCP in censoring access to a free and open internet, only to find years later that they had resuscitated a project called Project Dragonfly, which secretly was working with the CCP to create a version of a search engine in Google that included a Great Chinese Wall. So in either sides of the world, they're doing whatever allows them to aggregate the greatest power for themselves, saying what needs to be said appearing to say what needs to be said or doing the kinds of things that signal virtue in a way that allow them to aggregate greater profit and power. That's the name of the game. I care about the fact that the First Amendment in this country, in the United, from an American perspective at least, was created. If it was created to do one thing, it was to protect critics of the government, to give them the freedom to criticize the government. This was a critic of the government who the government wanted to silence but could not silence because there's this pesky thing called the First Amendment. So they used and pressured private companies that operate outside of the system of checks and balances that you have in the government to silence him instead. This would be something that has George Washington and George Orwell both doing backflips in their grave if they could actually see what was going on. That's what bothers me. And I could care less about the content of whether it's COVIDism, climatism, Alex Berenson or Schmerenson. That doesn't really matter to me. I think it's the principle that actually that I care about most. When the CCP tells you to jump, Apple asks how high. I'm pretty sure Elon Musk is going to have to be in a similar position too. I think some of his recent comments about Taiwan suggest as much, where he says that Taiwan should become a special administrative region of China, annexed to China. Well, guess what? He got a nice attaboy on the back, a little pat on the back when his Shanghai factory and regulator in China gave him a nice little tax break. Whether or not Apple was picking on Twitter, and Elon is a mercurial man, right? So one day he says that Apple wants to remove them from the App Store. The next day it's all honky-dory. Put aside the Twitter case, we know that Apple does this, right? That's what happened with Parler last year. And the illusion of choice is indeed an illusion where actually, if you wanted to, let's say, switch to an Android phone to be able to use the Google Play Store to have a social media app like Parler on your phone, Google did the same thing. I think that reveals the monopoly on ideas, right? And that's not quite a monopoly on products, but a monopoly on ideas. That's the real ideological cartel in Silicon Valley today. It's not a classical product cartel, it's an ideological cartel that's engaged not in price fixing in the strict sense. Yes, consumers get access to the modern internet for very low cost or even for free, widespread product choice. It's not quite price fixing. It is idea fixing, and Apple absolutely plays a role in that idea fixing scandal. If you get a form of government protection like Section 230 protection, well, guess what? You then abide by the same constraints as the federal government, which is according to the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. You can't have it both ways. Either you don't get this special form of governmental protection, or if you do, you abide by the same constraints. The Constitution exists to protect everyday citizens from governmental overreach, to preserve the freedoms of those citizens. You can't have the government then apply a cloak of immunity to some of those same private actors, with those private actors then being exempt from those constitutional constraints that are designed to protect those everyday citizens. So those are the kinds of solutions. I've written about this in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, reviving state action doctrines. When you see lurking state action in the guise of a private enterprise, it's still state action. I don't know about you guys on the other side of the pond, but we Americans sometimes need something to rhyme in order to remember it. And so, as I sometimes describe, if it's the Constitution, if it's state action in disguise, the Constitution still applies. And if a company is going to do the bidding of the government through the back door, then it turns out that company ought to be bound by things like the First Amendment, which here in the U.S. refers to the protection, among other things, on free speech. If there's a president of the United States who really cared about this, one of the things you'd do is to say that, over the last 5 years, every act of governmental coordination with a private company, I'm going to suss that out, and I'm going to actually make sure that those private companies, when carrying out the mandates of the government, are going to be operating according to the same constraints as the government, including according to constitutional constraints. That's not the kind of leadership we have right now in the U.S., but I think it is the kind of leadership that we need.